What's up guys, welcome back to another Call of Duty Modern Warfare video. In today's video we have exciting news about Modern Warfare ray tracing. This new technology from NVIDIA about real-time ray tracing is going to be coming to the PC version of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. So NVIDIA put out like this new blog post, this new news segment about like RTX, about real-time ray tracing within Modern Warfare. And they showed off a little bit of gameplay of the single player as well as some multiplayer as well, with the standard RTX on, RTX off comparisons. So there is some actual screenshots that they shared of RTX on versus RTX off. So that's what you guys are seeing on screen now. But it's a lot better to find to actually see this if you either go to their website, or I'll show you guys this in just a second. But if you go to their website, they have a little slider that you can personally manually slide back and forth. You can see what the scene looks like with ray tracing on versus ray tracing off. And honestly, it's really cool to kind of see the actual effects of ray tracing in game with the same exact screenshot. Because a lot of times it's not so subtle, so it's easier and better to do with a screenshot than say with a video, because in a video, it's lots of motion and it's continually moving, so it's really hard to pick out those small details that are going to show up with RTX, whereas a screenshot you can really just kind of focus on one part of the image and see what changes with it. So in this blog post, they say that back in June, Activision, Infinity Ward, and NVIDIA, they announced a partnership where they're going to be bringing the RTX real-time ray tracing to Call of Duty Modern Warfare on PC, alongside other NVIDIA gaming technologies. And they say that, with the game's October 25th release fast approaching, we can now reveal that the game is being enhanced with the real-time ray traced shadows within both the single-player campaign and 2v2 gunfight multiplayer mode. So it appears as though you are not going to be able to have ray tracing or whatever in multiplayer. I mean, they say that it's being enhanced with real-time ray traced shadows. So maybe that's the only ray tracing feature for Modern Warfare on the PC version. When you have ray tracing on, it's just the shadows rather than say reflections, because that was a big thing with ray tracing, was that it was basically all lighting. It was reflections, shadows, and stuff like God rays and other shadow maps and just other lighting things is what ray tracing was. But it somehow appears that for Modern Warfare it's only going to be for the shadows. So I'm not sure if we're going to be getting more than that or whatever, but that's what they say here in this blog post, so that's what I'm going to go off of. But they say that it'll be available in both the single-player campaign and the 2v2 gunfight multiplayer mode. So, two things right there. Of course, it's going to be available in single-player. Everybody pretty much already knew that, because single-player is really where they want to showcase this new engine and how it looks and all the graphics and stuff. And that's where they traditionally kind of stretch everything to its absolute limits, is in the campaign. That's where you can have frame rate drops below 60 FPS. I mean, they try and avoid them where they can, but that's traditionally where they have the biggest set pieces and some of the biggest actual environments and stuff too, is in the single player campaign. And a lot of times in the single player campaign it's a little bit rougher, and there's not quite that same fluidity and that same solid 60 FPS like you'll get in the multiplayer. And the other reason why it's in the 2v2 gunfight multiplayer mode rather than every single part of multiplayer is most likely because of the actual performance cost of having real-time ray trace shadows when you actually are playing. And so since gunfight modes are they're these small maps, they're confined to a small map, there's not much that can really change within the map. There's not gonna be massive vehicles or kill streaks or stuff like that, and it's only 4 players in there. It's probably less of an impact to have real-time ray trace shadows on when you're playing gunfight mode, as opposed to say this new ground war where you're playing 40v40 or something like that, and you have real-time ray trace shadows as well as 60 people on your screen at the same time. That's gonna absolutely tank performance. Whereas if you're just doing 2v2 gunfight mode, then it's not going to have as profound of an impact. But honestly, I still feel like they should enable the setting to be used across any mode. That way, if you really want to have ray tracing enabled in multiplayer, you can. But it sounds like the real-time ray trace shadows specifically is only available in the single player and the 2v2 gunfight multiplayer mode. I don't know what to think about that, guys. What do you guys think about that? Also, before we get into the comparison, I just want to show you guys this video that NVIDIA actually released on their channel. And this is what they showed off in regards to RTX within the campaign. So this gives us a little bit of gameplay of the Modern Warfare single player campaign. I mean, we have not gotten like any gameplay thus far other than like the reveal trailer. This actually shows part of a mission and then also shows some of the 2v2 multiplayer gunfight mode with ray tracing on and ray tracing off as well. So that's pretty cool. But let's actually go ahead and let's show you guys what real-time ray tracing, what this all looks like in-game in Modern Warfare. Alright guys, so this is the first image that they're showing of a comparison between RTX on and RTX off. So on the left here, we have ray tracing off, and on the right, we have ray tracing on. So if you guys go to the link in the video description, you guys will be able to compare yourselves what it looks like. But like I said, on the right, this is RTX on, RTX off, and you can see in the bottom right, if I go all the way to the right, it says off, all the way to the left, it says on. So this is what it looks like on, and we're just going to kind of go through a comparison here and showcase pretty much everything that changes within every one of these scenes. So let's start with this off, that way we can really see some of the big differences here. So as we start to have it turned on through the scene, one of the big differences that stands out to me here, there are three things. First off, the brick. Second, the foliage. Third, this post. So first off, let's talk about the foliage. Foliage right here, it's pretty shadowy and it just looks pretty standard, but with RTX on, there's not many shadows on it anymore, and it's like pretty lit up still, so it kind of changes the look of some of this foliage as well. Second thing is that this post with RTX off, it is pretty shadowed, looks kind of gray, but then if you have RTX on, it looks pretty brown all around. Like it just, I don't know, it looks weird. Basically, what you're going to see with a lot of these screenshots and these comparisons here is you're going to see a lot of things that the shadows just kind of look odd, and it's hard to kind of get a grasp on what it looks like, what it would look like in reality compared to what we know, video games look like. This is obviously what traditional games have looked like, but this is with this new RTX ray tracing technology. So honestly, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about that, but basically the whole implementation of this is that the light is being cast as rays and it is bouncing off different things in the scene. So this light is bouncing off this wall, it's bouncing off the ground here, bouncing off this, it's being like reflected by some of their helmets, being absorbed in some of these things. But it says that for Modern Warfare, the big thing is the shadows. So you're not going to really see huge differences in lighting here. So like if we go past this light, you're not really seeing much of a difference there because it's basically only ray tracing the shadows. And also with like reflections, I guess they're not having real-time ray traced reflections. It's just the shadows. So once again, you're not going to see pretty much any, if much of a difference at all. So once again, let's go back here on RTX off. On this brick, it is facing away from the light, so it's pretty shadowed. You can't really make out much detail here, and that's because it's being obscured. Well, if you have RTX on, now you can actually make out a lot of that brickwork and the fine detail there, because once again, like I said, the light is being reflected off of like everything in the scene, and it's bouncing off things, and so it's still obscured, it's still shadowed, but it's not as much. It's not like this pitch black thing that it was before. So now you can actually make out some of those details. Another thing you might notice around here is that it looks like the geometry changes just a little bit. It looks like there's not really a connection there, but then all of a sudden the geometry like changes. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but it looks like the geometry changes. Another thing is that right here we have a shadow behind this character. He's casting a shadow because obviously he's standing in front of the light. With RTX on, the shadow remains, but then you still get some kind of light that bleeds through. So the light will reflect off this brick, reflect downwards, and just give you a little bit more detail in the shadows than previously. It's like pitch black, like you can basically not see anything that's in that shadow. Whereas in real life, light bounces all around, so you can see it, like pick out some details in shadows. Like if there's any type of light reflects off of basically everything and will go around things, and so you're not, in reality there's not a lot of super hard shadowed edges because I mean, even if there is hard shadowed edges, like it's not a pitch black shadow because obviously the light will reflect on things and reflect in there and lighten up what's being obscured. So that's something right there. Like you see, you can't even see that he has a pouch there, and then all of a sudden, bam! With RTX on, you can actually tell. Another thing I want to point out to you guys, I mean, like look right there with RTX off, there's a shadow right here on this post. RTX on, there's like no shadow. And another thing goes down right here. So we have RTX off, and you see that, you know, there's like two shadows being cast together. We have one from this guy standing right here. You know, obviously he's casting the shadow that goes down this way, and then one of these characters is casting this shadow, which they, you know, combine. And since, you know, it makes it even darker because they're combined. Well, with RTX on, see how the shadow almost disappears? It's this really weird technique, at least in my opinion, where it seems like a lot of these shadows basically disappear because it's not like they're just on like a lower setting or something like that, because even if you have like shadows on lower settings, traditionally it's just like the resolution at which it draws these lines is lower, or it, you know, it's kind of like a mesh rather than like a solid thing. That's traditionally what like lower shadow quality does, but this is like totally different because it's real-time ray traced. So you still get some shadow here. So like you guys can see right here where his leg is, there's still a shadow there, but there's like no shadow where he was. And I think it's obviously more realistic this way because there's a super bright light that's hitting him, yeah, and there's definitely going to be a shadow there, but it's also bouncing off this wall right here, going past him, bouncing off this over here, bouncing off all these bricks on the bottom, and landing everywhere. So in reality, there wouldn't be this super, super dark shadow there because the light is going to bounce off everything and really lighten that up, which is what it's doing when RTX is on. So another detail I want to point out is check out this these little scraps of wood that are hanging out just like right here. With RTX off, there is like no shadow. I mean, there's a shadow down here, but that's about it. But then if we have RTX on, all of a sudden they have a shadow now, and it gives it a little bit more dimension. It's a little bit more three-dimensional. And then also something like weird is going on right here with some of this geometry here. It almost looks like it kind of sinks in when you have RTX on. Not 100% sure what's going on there, but it kind of changes, so that's a little weird. Not a whole lot goes along here. I mean, there's this like hard edge right there that disappears when you have RTX on because obviously the light's bouncing there. It's bouncing off everything in the scene that really kind of just like dissipates a lot of those super hard edged shadows. Well, another thing we have here is that if you look in here, this is all obscured because RTX is off. Well, if you have RTX on, then you can actually make out like the brickwork here. Like this whole thing right there. Whoa, my bad. That is kind of obscuring it, you know, but when you have RTX off, there's not a whole lot you can pick out here. I mean, you can kind of tell it's brick, but it's pretty shadowed. Can't really tell what's going on there. Well, as soon as you have RTX on, you can actually see that there's a lot more detail and shimmer on the bricks because it's bouncing off this, it's bouncing off everything in the scene, and you can actually make out a lot of what's happening in these shadows. So that is pretty much all that is happening with this scene here. Another thing I actually want to point out here, lastly, is just this tire and also some of these plants and vegetation right here as well. So with RTX off on this tire, it's not like a perfectly hard edge. It's a softer edge, but there's still like a pretty significant edge nonetheless. Well, with RTX on, it fades it quite a bit. I mean, it's definitely not as like solid of a shadow and definitely not as dark of a shadow when you actually have ray tracing on. And then also, there is like no shadow going on here by the edge of this building when you have RTX off, but then you have it on and all of a sudden the shadow actually appears because it's being properly occluded and, you know, it's calculating all the different rays and just has to calculate where each like shadow map and every part of the shadow should be and how to get it as realistic as possible. One thing that's not about ray tracing that I do want to point out in this scene is this tire. You can obviously see some of these like hard edges on this tire. You can see that like this is what we have in a lot of previous Call of Duty games and a lot of video games in general, because it's really hard to draw a circle when you're drawing it in 2 dimensions like this is. Like this is obviously a 2-dimensional image, but it's really hard to draw circles. So traditionally we have things, it's basically just like a lot of octagons and a lot of polygons just stacked together, which are just like a ton of straight lines. And there is techniques you can get to where it looks almost flawless in a circle, but still like I mean, obviously you can see that there's still like, bam, cuts down there, bam, cuts there. Like, this is what we have in a lot of previous Call of Duty games. And obviously real life tires aren't like that. Tires don't just like cut like it's an actual smooth circle in real life. Which, in one of the blog posts Activision posted a couple months ago, talking about the new engine for Modern Warfare, they said they had something like 5 times the geometry that they could put into every scene compared to like the previous engine, which means that like on geometry, like their helmets and stuff, there's going to be a lot more polygons, and they have something like 27 million polygons as opposed to 5 in the previous game per frame or whatever. But it looks like not a lot of that polygon budget is spent on this tire, which maybe that was just a design decision, or that, I don't know, maybe this was a reused asset. I just thought it was interesting nonetheless to point that out, because I mean, it is like, it's not smooth. Like, they need to up that poly count right there to actually make that look more realistic, more lifelike. But that was the first image. Now let's go ahead and let's look at the second image that they provided. So that first image was of the single player campaign. Now we are going to be showing off multiplayer. So this is of the gunfight mode. It's on this map here. We've seen something interesting at the Modern Warfare multiplayer reveal when we had like Courage, Syndicate, TP, and Legion. All those guys were playing. They played a lot on this map, but this map was like during the day, whereas you can see here it's like at night with a lot of the lights turned off. Also, these images are in here for a reason. They're all specified because they have a lot of light and they have shadows, and they're really meant to highlight the strengths and maybe even some of the weaknesses of ray tracing and this new implementation of it in Modern Warfare. So once again, ray tracing on the right, ray tracing off on the left. So if we scroll this through, there's not a ton of difference on this right side of the image, right? So if we like just go between these two, there's not a ton. I mean, obviously you see some like shadows over here. There's like a little bit of a hard edge right there on there, some hard edges on the shadows over here. But then as soon as you have RTX on, those hard shadowed edges disappear. Watch, there's some hard shadowed edges right there. Boom, they're gone. Then as we move over here, there's like just about no difference right around this part of the image. And part of the reason about that, like you might be thinking like, okay, well, why isn't that like lighter? And like, because if we come over here, you guys can obviously tell that this section of the image is a lot lighter because you have RTX on. But why isn't that? Well, the reason is because you only have like 6 lights in this scene, and they're all pointed downwards. So there's no direct light hitting that, and it's pointed downwards. So the light really can't reflect up and bounce off of anything to hit that. So that's why there's still portions of this that are definitely obscured, because even in reality, light would not touch that up there. I mean, it might be a little faint. Like you can see kind of a little bit of a difference up there between them. But honestly, that's realistic. That's more lifelike. But as we come over here to this side of the image, one thing I want to point out right away is if you look at this light is bouncing and it's hitting this railing, and that's what is causing this. This is the shadow from this railing right here. Well, when you have RTX on, you can definitely see the shadow from the railing. Looks pretty realistic. But then if you have RTX on, the shadow just disappears, which I think is really interesting and weird, because like obviously the light should be hitting that, and it should be pretty obscured because of the railing. So it should be obscured like this and cause a shadow. Like it might not be as pronounced and it might not be as dark as it is there, but there definitely should still be a shadow. Whereas if you have RTX on, there's like no shadow to be seen at all there. So I'm not sure what's going on there. I thought it was just something interesting to point out. And then as we come along here, this is the section of the image you want to pay attention to. So right now with RTX off, you guys can see all these hard edges on all these shadows right here. Kind of fades out in here because you're getting some of this light that kind of bleeds through and reflects here. You can see this hard shadow right here because this light's hitting it. This light's also hitting it. And you can see some of like the differences in some of the depth of the shadows. Some of these are a little bit darker than others. But when you have RTX on, basically every one of these shadows disappear except for this thing right here. That does not move. That pretty much stays. But these ones right here that are being obstructed by any of these number of things, all that, poof, it's just gone. Like you have a little bit of shadow there, but like, yeah, it's gone. Like another thing to point out though, it's kind of cool to notice that you pretty much did not even know that there was a thing there. I mean, you could kind of make something out. You didn't really know what it was. You couldn't make it out. But then if you have RTX on, bam, all of a sudden you can see that there's like this little target or something that's there hiding on the floor. So really interesting. Another thing with this light here, like I said before, there was this really sharp line right here because you had this light and this light. Well, as soon as you have RTX on, the angle of the light changes. It's not just that the light kind of disappears, the angle of the light changes, probably because this is more of a direct light on it compared to this one, or like different brightness levels or whatever, but I thought that was kind of weird and interesting of a change. And then as we bring it over here, you can see that this has a pretty dark shadow over here and lines, and it basically disappears. So the next screenshot takes place like right here in this scene, but overall with ray tracing, it basically seems to get rid of a lot of these hard edges on shadows, kind of blend them in more so into the environment, and that's a lot of it. It's just removing a lot of those shadows, which I think is interesting because it's like, yeah, you have these really hard shadows here, but then all of a sudden you have RTX on, and it's like the shadows disappear. It's this really weird thing. It like blurs the edges, softens up like the actual brightness of the shadow, and then also definitely like removes a lot of the shadows that were present in some of these scenes as well. So next up, let's check out the one that takes place here. So this is right there where the camera is pointed up here in the last scene, but once again, RTX on the right, RTX off on the left. So if we start out with it all off, here we go. Now it's on, off, on, off, on. Okay, let's start from the right. So as we go through here, not a whole lot of changes. Once again, I mean, you can kind of see a change right there. That's about the only change in the scene, other than, say, the fence. You can actually see now with RTX on, there's like, you can actually see the light is like hitting this fence, whereas before, the light wasn't even like touching the fence at all. So that's kind of a cool little change, a little detail there. But then you see these, like there's this cloth here. Well, if you have RTX on, the light is actually like shining underneath it and hits some of this stuff down here, which is interesting. But with RTX off, it just like completely obscures it. It's pretty dark down here. You can't really make out what's going on at all. Even with RTX on, you can't really make out what's going on down here because there's only this one light and it's being obscured. But of course, right here, this whole section right here, that's being shadowed with it off. And then as soon as you turn it on, you can actually make out like, hey, there's some like little bit of rubble or brick or whatever like hanging out right there. Whereas you had no idea before. This shadow kind of disappears. And if you look at the reflection looks like it stays just about exactly the same. And I'll talk about that in a second. But of course then we have these other shadows over here that basically all but disappear. The only shadow that really remains in the scene is this one going across right here where my mouse is at. That's about the only one that remains. So we just have that one. You see all these bullet casings? This one, the shadow comes over here, hits a lot of these bullet casings, and then if you have RTX on, no, shadow just goes away. Like this little shadow right here, nah, it's just gone now. So once again, I'm not sure about like the full details on this implementation of ray tracing in regarding to the shadows, but it's kind of cool though to see that a lot of the shadows disappear. But it's not like if you're playing a game without shadows turned on. Like I said, like if you try and play a game without shadows, the game just looks terrible. Like it looks so awful. The texture quality just looks whack. The whole game just looks so weird without any shadows. But it's not like that. It's not like you're just disabling the shadows. It's like you're softening them up. Like I said, you're softening the edges on the shadows, and you're also lightening a lot of the shadows as well. So like this shadow right here is pretty dark. And you bring this over it, and it definitely lightens it up quite a bit. So, yeah, like I had no idea there was like a cinder block or whatever right there. Well, there is, yeah. So, lastly, I want to point out here that the reflections here, like I said, the reflections don't change, and that is largely probably due to the fact that there's not going to be ray traced reflections. It's only ray traced shadows. So it's probably not like ray traced lighting or reflections, just shadows. So, if that was the case, if this was actually ray tracing the reflections, you'd be able to see a difference in some of the lighting here. So you'd be able to see like the reflection would be a little bit brighter, whereas it looks like this game kind of has like pre-baked reflections, or it uses like screen space reflections. Either or, it basically takes like a still image or whatever. It takes what's up here, like inverts it, uses a filter, blurs it, and that's what's down here. So in a lot of games, it's not actually real time. So in a lot of older games, some of the newer games are kind of using different methods to kind of fake it. But if you are like in an older game, let's even take like a Call of Duty game for example. If you're playing Call of Duty Ghosts, this is something that I noticed during gameplay quite a bit. Is if you have a sniper scope and you can look at the reflection of the sniper scope, it is a reflection of the area you're in, specifically in that game. It like reflects like what portion of the map you're on, but it does not adjust accordingly to where you're looking. It's just like, here's a pre-baked image from this section of the map that we're going to slap on top of this scope as like, you know, a reflection. So that's could be what's going on here, or it could just be screen space, whereas screen space literally only reflects what you're seeing on the screen. So you can kind of like mess with it a little bit if you have items that are not on your screen that should be in the reflection. They actually won't be, because of that's like the way you can tell if it's screen space or not, is because like say if there's an object, something up here towards above this that should be in here, well, if you're not actually looking at it, it's not going to show up in the reflection. But as soon as you look at it, it will show up in the reflection. So that's what screen space reflections is. But like I said, it does not appear that reflections are ray traced in the slightest at all. It's only shadows, and the lighting, specific like God rays or anything like that, also doesn't appear to be ray traced as well. It just appears that we're only going to be getting ray traced shadows in Modern Warfare. So that was the comparison right there, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And once again, I'll leave the links in the description that you guys can go and check it out and do it for yourself. But yeah, nonetheless, that is RTX. That is the implementation of ray tracing in Modern Warfare thus far. Let me know your guys' thoughts on this in the comments down below. What do you guys think about this? Does this look good or not? Also, if you guys do have a graphics card that supports ray tracing and you're going to be getting Modern Warfare on PC, let me know. Are you guys actually going to run ray tracing? And do you find this fascinating enough to actually warrant you actually enabling it? Because ray tracing has been notorious for having a huge impact on your performance and absolutely just dropping your frame rates. So what do you guys think? Is this worth it to you to have this on, or are you just basically going to leave it off in the campaign and in the gunfight mode for that like boost in performance as well? Let me know that in the comments down below, guys. What do you guys think about this whole thing in general? But nonetheless, it's exciting. I mean, ray tracing, having the option is good. Even if you guys don't like the option is better than no option. Like, it's better to have this and not enable it than to just not have it at all. So there you guys go. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.